Hi folks, this is Tim Garman for SIT, teaching on NZDP 101, and this is an introduction to Photoshop, and I'm going to be starting pretty much from the beginning. So if you're new to Photoshop, this is a good place to start. If you think you know your way around it pretty well, you might want to skip this, but there might also be a few tips that you pick up, so have a listen in. So just a few things to say before we get started. This is the current version of Photoshop as I'm recording it, but Adobe does update Photoshop regularly throughout the year. So that means any video tutorial quickly goes out of date. This could be out of date next week for all I know. So if you find that you're looking at a tutorial and it doesn't match the version that you have, either this tutorial is newer or maybe your version is newer, don't panic. There may not be too many differences to begin with, but if you find that there is, do drop me an email, ideally earlier in the week so that there's a bit of response time. But that's the best way to handle that, so I can clear up any confusion for you. We don't insist that students have the latest version. That's not always an option for students. So there will be students on a number of different versions of Photoshop. So we try to cater for everybody. The other thing to say is Photoshop appears to be a very big and confusing program. And to some extent it is. But let me just say that it actually looks more confusing or bigger than it actually is. And that is because if we look at the screen now, we see some tools down on the left, we see some palettes over on the right, and we see menu items at the top. But if we open one of these palettes, the layers palette for instance, we'll see that each palette has a menu of its own. Just going off the screen here, but you can see most of that, I believe. And that seems like a lot of menus. Well, it is, but you need to know that there's a lot of repetition. A lot of what you find in this menu on the right is repeated up the top, and that happens in a number of different places. So it makes it look bigger than it actually is. So don't let that overwhelm you. So let's make a start. It's also worth saying that if you're looking for a very quick response to a question that you've got, the quickest way of tackling that is to research it yourself and to look on Google or YouTube. Of course, looking at YouTube tutorials is a great thing to do, but they may not match the version that you're running as well. So keep that in mind. But really taking responsibility for researching issues and different ways of doing things is over to you. But I'm always at the end of an email, so drop me an email as early in the week as possible if you need answers to questions, and I'm certainly going to do my best to help. It's worth saying, as far as that goes, that if you're partway through one of the assignments and you're stuck, it's so much easier for me to help if you send me a screenshot of where you've got to. So I'll need a screenshot of your Photoshop window that includes all the layers, if you're using layers, which we'll get into in a few weeks' time. Includes all these palettes and this control strip or option strip at the top. I think option strip is a newer term for that, which does change every time you select a tool. And try and include your menu at the top as well. So if I can see everything, then I can answer your question more quickly. So send a screenshot as an attachment. If you don't know how to do a screenshot, you can always ask me, but you can Google that as well. Now, it's also worth saying that I'm working on a Mac. Now, you may be on a PC. Generally, PCs are more common in the business world. Macs are pretty common in the creative field though, so that's why a lot of tutors prefer Macs. But there's not much difference between a Mac and a PC when we get into Photoshop. A couple of differences, or one difference that I'm aware of, is if you need to find preferences on a Mac. Preferences, and this is how we go and fine tune some of the settings. Preferences is up here. On a PC, I believe it's called Options, and I can't remember where that is. It might be under Edit, but I'm sure you'll be able to find that yourself. The other difference is that keyboard shortcuts can be a bit different, but we won't let that worry us at the moment. Now, I'm going to run through what we see on the screen. I'm not going to cover every single tool or every single setting. That would take far too long, and some of them we don't use for this course. But let's start by opening an image. How do we open an image? Well, we can drag and drop an image into this window. I've got one off the screen here. I'm just going to drag in, and as you can see, this is the test calibration screen that we use to calibrate our monitors. And it's worth saying, just as we look at this, that if your monitor is calibrated correctly, you should be able to see the difference between 0 and 5% over on the left, and 95% and 100%. Now on my screen, those last two are pretty close, but I can see a difference in shade. And I can certainly see a difference in shade between 0 and 5%. So that's a good reference guide for if your screen is calibrated correctly. Now, I'm just going to close that down. To close that file, I can go to close, but you'll notice that as we look at the menu, we have a keyboard shortcut as well, which is Command W on a Mac. That would be Control W on a PC. Now, I'm not going to remember all the PC shortcuts, but I'll do my best on that. So I'm just going to close that down and just show you another way of opening a file. So up to File, and we've got Open, of course, Command or Control O. And if we wanted to open or start a new file, we've got Command N, or just select New from this menu. We can also open as a smart object. Now, there's going to be more information about smart objects as we move through the course, but that's a good method of opening a file if you want it to be linked to Camera Raw. More about that later. So let's just, for the moment, we'll just go to Open, and you would browse for your image. I've got it ready to go here, and I've just opened up the screen calibration image. I may need to grab a different image at some point, but let's have a look at what we've got on the screen here and what Photoshop can offer us. So we've got various tools down on the left, and you see a little arrow at the top. If you prefer those tools to be in a single line, you can have them like that. I prefer them that way because it looks to me as if they're a bit larger, and I'm just used to viewing them that way. Whenever we choose a new tool, it changes the content of the options strip at the top here, and we've got some settings in here that we can use to control how these tools perform. So each tool will change the content, and we'll look at those individually as we come to them. Over on the right, we have the different palettes that are available. I mentioned the Layers palette earlier on. If I click on there, it opens it up for us, and you'll see there's some other tabs there with other palettes just in that same view. And so we've got the Paths palette, for instance. You'll see that's listed down here as well. If I close that that bank of palettes just by double clicking the layer, in fact just clicking it once closes it, and we can go to the Paths palette, and you see that's opened up that tab, and Layers is hidden in there as well. If we want to go to the Layers palette and bring that to the front, we can just go there. So we've got a bunch of palettes here. Now, if you're looking for something specific and you can't find it on the palettes, go up to Window, because here is a list of all the palettes, and you'll see the Layers palette it's got a tick against it. That's because that's the one that I've got active at the moment. But if the palette that you're looking for is not in this bank, you can find it here. I'm just looking for something that isn't there. Not easy to find instantly, but perhaps we won't worry about that. So layers. We see here we've got a single layer in the layers palette, and that is the layer that this calibration image is sitting on. We can switch it off. Actually, we can't switch it off because, of course, it's actually locked. You see the padlock icon. If I click that, it actually unlocks the layer. And we could now switch it off. You'll notice that when we switch it off, we see this checkerboard effect. Now that's how Photoshop indicates nothing. Now if that was white, white is technically in Photoshop not nothing. It's a white background. You would have to fill something with white to get it to appear white. So Photoshop uses a checkered background to indicate that there's nothing there. It's totally transparent. Now there's a few more things I can say about the layer palette. I don't want to get too heavily into it at the moment, but I will just say that if we go up to the menu in the layers palette, we can create a new layer there. And we're instantly asked, do we want to call it something? It'll give it an automatic name of layer 1. It is a good habit to get into of naming your layers. We won't for this particular example, but when you start to have lots of layers, do please name your layers. We have some other things we can do. We can assign a color to it, and I won't get into modes at the moment, but we'll be covering that later. So I've clicked OK. So now I have a second layer. There's nothing on it, and as you can see, if I switch the other layer off by clicking the eye icon, there's nothing on that layer, so it's got that checkered background on it showing nothing or transparency. So the reason I want two layers here is because one thing you can do with layers is change the order of them. Now that can be quite useful. All I've just done is clicked and dragged. That can be useful as you start to build up different layers. It can be important what order they appear in. Let me just do that again and put the blank one to the top. Also, you'll notice this is highlighted in grey. You can actually change that highlight. You may have a different highlight color on your in your Photoshop, but it's important when you're working on files, if you've got more than one layer, it's important to select the correct layer. If I want to draw on top of this calibration image, but I don't want to destroy what's already there, I can work on a separate layer, but I must select it just by highlighting that layer. And now if I chose the brush tool, and I might just need to, it's only set on 1 pixel, we're not going to see much of that. So let's just take it up a bit bigger. I'll come to those settings in a minute. But we can actually draw onto that layer. And we can see that we can switch it on and off. And it's not affecting what's underneath. So we're working non-destructively there. We're not destroying the image that we have. And we're going to get into that method of working quite a lot in this course. Another thing we can do, we've got some other settings that link to this layers palette. We've got opacity. We can take the opacity down just on that one layer. And you see that's reduced the black to a transparent grey. Let's just take it, let's leave it there. We've got some different modes here, and we'll be getting into this later on as well, but I might just select or perhaps run through them. They'll all do different things, and sometimes it'll depend on the image that you're using as to what effect it gives. Some won't give any effect unless you've got a particular image or a particular color. but it's a way of blending the two layers together. Very useful for creating shadows. So we've got two layers there. Another way we can create a new layer is down at the bottom using these icons at the bottom here. So we've got, and in fact, if we hold our mouse over them for long enough, we get a tag that appears. So create a new layer is that one, and we get another layer. So we've now got three, and we can change the order of those completely. Now you remember I unlocked this bottom layer, so I can now actually drag something below it. When you open up a file to begin with, and we could just, let's just close this one down. We won't save it, but we're going to open it again. I'm just going to do that on a keyboard shortcut, Command-O. Open the same file. So you'll see when it's only one layer and the layer is locked, if I created a new layer, I can't drag that below that layer. It won't let me, because when it's a background layer, it is the base layer. There's nothing that can be below that. And also you can't, or you can switch it off now that I've got two layers. But if you wanted to drag something below that layer, you would have to unlock it, and then you can do that. So that's a quick look at layers. Let's close that down. I would just mention perhaps that under the Windows menu, where you've got all the palettes listed, you've also got Workspace. Now Workspace is about customizing your Photoshop to how you want it to appear, and it's got some presets here. I tend to have it set on Essentials, but that's because I do a lot of graphic design work, and those are the tools that I like to have. But you can also set it to a photographic workspace, and so when you do that, you see you've got your histogram and other things that would be relevant to photography. You've got properties and things like this. Now all those are accessible even if I'm on my Essentials setting. I can get to those. See, we've got properties here, for instance. Photoshop gives you an opportunity to customize your screen to the way you want it. You can even select a customized layout for those workspaces. But I suspect that's not something that we might need for this course particularly. I've mentioned the palettes. I've mentioned that they've each got their own menus. One thing it's worth mentioning is the very useful undo tool. So let's just go to my layer palette. Let's swap those round. If I make some kind of edit to my image and I'm not happy with that, Command Z on a Mac or Control Z on a PC enables us to undo that, and you can do that multiple times. So that is, of course, pretty helpful. Now let's look at some of our tools over on the left. And I'm aware that I'm whizzing through this. You may well need to pause the video and go back. I'm trying not to go too quickly, but if I talk too slowly, I begin to sound like a zombie. So we don't want that. So let's look at the tools running from the top. And you'll notice we get this useful little tag that tells us what the tool does. So this is the mover tool. And we can move part of an image round using that. Now that's going to work because I've got a couple of layers open. Let me just check that. I'm going to close that down, reopen that file. So we've just got one layer. It doesn't work when you've got just one locked layer. Let's try that again. because Photoshop also gives us some error messages. It says currently selected layer is a background layer. That's because there's only one layer and it's locked. You cannot move a background layer or change its stacking order, blending mode or opacity. However, you can convert it to a normal layer and then change any of these attributes. If I click that, it's going to have the same effect as if I click the padlock icon. And you'll see now it's actually moved to where I moved it to, and we can move it back into roughly the same position. Okay, so that's the mover tool. Now it's worth saying as well that you see there's a tiny little triangle in the bottom right corner of that tool, and if we hold our mouse down, there's another tool there. That's the artboard tool. I'm not going to get into that. It's not something we particularly use for this course, but you'll notice that lots of these tools have those little triangles. If we go to this one, there's a number of selection tools here. So if you're looking for tools and you can't find the right tool, keep in mind it may be hidden under one of the other tools. And I think I'm right in saying that if you change that order, so if I change that to the elliptical marquee tool, that's what will appear when you open Photoshop up next. So if you were looking for the rectangular marquee tool and the last one you used was the elliptical one, it's going to be hidden underneath. So just be aware of that. If you can't find it there, check under some of these tools and you will get used to finding where things are. So let's look at this set of tools that we're on now. These are selection tools. So if I drag my mouse and click and drag over an area of the image, that selects that area. Now, if I went to the mover tool, I could chop that out. I'm going to undo that, Command Z, Control Z. Now, if you want to deselect, you can go up to the select menu and you can select deselect. But it's a good shortcut to remember, Command D or Control D. And often the initial of the shortcut relates to what it does. So deselect, Command D. So we'll do that, Command D, and the selection disappears. So we've got other selection tools. We can do an ellipse. I'll deselect that. Now it's also worth saying that if you want a square, hold the Shift key down, and that constrains the proportions. That's also the case with the ellipse tool. If I add Shift, we get a circle. So the proportions are constrained. And we've got some other selection tools as well under this tool. We can select a single row of pixels or a single column. Moving down, we've got the lasso tool. Let's start with that one. It's normally on the top. And as it says here, makes a freehand selection. So I can draw and it will select that shape. Let's deselect that and draw a more fancy sort of shape. So we can select in that method. Might be useful or more useful if you're using a Wacom tablet with a cordless pen for that sort of thing. Not essential for Photoshop, but some students may have that. Also worth saying that wherever you stop, it's going to draw a line between the two endpoints. More often we would go to the endpoint, but it will draw that automatically if we don't. So we've also got a polygonal lasso tool. That is creating straight lines. So I'm just clicking once with the mouse. I'm not clicking and dragging, I'm just clicking and then moving to a different spot, clicking, and then when I go over the endpoint, you'll see you get that little circle next to the cursor. As soon as I click, it gives me a selection. So let's deselect that, and that might be useful if you wanted to select an area. And in fact, if I hold the Shift key down, it will make sure that that line is straight. So I'm holding the Shift key down so you can go straight, horizontally, straight, vertically. And one other thing it might be worth saying is you can actually go, if I click and do an oblique line, that will keep that to 45 degrees if that is something that's important. And 45 degrees down. So that's a different type of selection tool. Another type of selection tool is the magnetic lasso tool. This could be quite useful because it follows a shape. You'll notice I'm not clicking, but it is following that area. So we get to the end and it gives me a selection around that shape. Now it hasn't selected it exactly, but that may be a useful quick way of selecting something, and maybe something with high contrast like this black square, it's going to do more effectively. So that's a magnetic lasso tool. Let's just deselect that selection. We've got a quick selection tool, and that's useful if we want to just click and drag over an area, and it will see where lines are defined and select those areas. Now, why hasn't it selected that particular shape? Well, that's because, as I mentioned, with each tool there are a number of settings up here in the option strip, and with the quick selection tool, we've got a number of things here. We can change the size of the brush. So if it's a large area we want to select, we can do that. We can also, if we have more than one layer, we can change whether we're sampling all layers or just the layer that we have selected. So again, that's useful. We've also got an option to add to the selection. So if I start here and let's go there, for instance. So it's done a rough job of selecting that area. We wanted to, in fact, it automatically gives us the add to selection option, so that if we come over here, you see it's increased our selection. We can subtract from it like that. Now it's also worth saying that we can do this on the keyboard as well. If I've gone back to the quick selection option, if I hold down my Alt key, it's an option key on a Mac, Alt on a PC, you see within the middle of the brush I get a small minus sign, and that will also delete from the selection. And that can be quite useful for tidying things up a bit. If I release the Alt button, I can go back to let's do that. I would suggest play with that and just get a feel for how that's working. So that's a quick selection tool. Let's deselect that. We've also got the Magic Wand tool, which is a single click selection. So if I'm clicking in this particular 20%, that's 30% shade of grey, it chooses a large area. Why is that? Well, that's because if we again look up in the option strip, we've got a tolerance level. And the tolerance level gives us a way of measuring how much difference we want in the area selected. So with a high tolerance, 30 is a reasonably high number, I suppose, it's selecting a larger area. If we just, let's delete that, if we set that to 0, it's going to select 1 pixel. If I set that to say 5, it's selecting a larger area. In fact, maybe if we set it to 1, so it's selecting one shade there, and obviously there's a little dot there that may be a slightly different shade. So you can play with that tolerance to get the selection that you want. So that's the magic wand selection. Now I've just clicked with the object selection tool, and I've clicked in this this image area. It's thinking about that because it's quite a complex image. And it's selected an area of that image, and that may not be exactly what we want, but again we've got to decide what area of an image we want to select and what tool is appropriate, and that's going to change depending on what kind of image we're working on. Now let's have a look at the crop tool. So underneath the crop tool we've got some other tools. We've got slice tools and a perspective crop tool, but let's stick to the simple crop tool, and it does pretty much what you would expect. If we crop in, let's close this layer for a minute, or this palette I should say, the layers palette. We can crop in, select an area. You'll notice we have a grid which is useful for composition. If you're thinking about the rule of thirds is the expression I'm trying to think of, the rule of thirds composition, where we divide our image into 9 or 3 columns and rows. So we've cropped down. If we double click, we can make that crop actually happen. But I'm going to undo what I've just done, and as we have the crop tool selected, I want to draw your attention to the options strip, because there's an important box here, delete cropped pixels. Now if we have that selected, it does pretty much what it says. When we crop an area, anything that's cropped out is gone for good. But if we leave that unchecked, and I would recommend that you do leave it unchecked, it means that if we crop an area down and then go to crop it again, you'll see that cropped area of pixels is still there, still available, so you can come back if we made an error and recrop and bring it back in. But that's only if we leave that box unchecked. One other thing I'll draw your attention to as we go to crop an image, if we go outside this area, you notice that if we go and keep going out of the corner, we suddenly get a rotating arrow, a double-headed arrow, which gives us the opportunity to rotate our image and crop it down. You'll notice it's cropping it to where the image is rotated to without actually giving us any of the blank area outside of that. And double click that, and we've suddenly got a rotated image that's also cropped. And because we haven't deleted the cropped pixels, we can go back and retrieve them if necessary. So I'm going to undo what I've just done,